The wind howled across the Wyoming high plains like a banshee's cry, carrying with it the bite of winter that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the desolate landscape in an unforgiving white shroud that stretched endlessly toward the gray horizon. The small frontier town of Mercy's Bend huddled against the storm like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by some giant's careless hand, its few buildings offering scant refuge from nature's cruelty. Clara Whitmore pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she pressed herself deeper into the narrow alcove beside Murphy's General Store. The thin wool offered little protection against the cutting wind, and her worn boots, more whole than leather now, had long since surrendered to the snow that seeped through to her stockings. Her lips, once soft and pink, had turned pale with cold, and her fingers ached as she clutched the small bundle that contained everything she owned in this world: a spare dress, a worn Bible, and the faded daguerreotype of the woman she used to be. 3 days had passed since Mrs. Kowalski had thrown her out of the boarding house, her voice sharp with disgust as she declared that decent folk didn't harbor women of Clara's unfortunate circumstances. The old woman's words still echoed in Clara's mind. A wife who can't give her husband children ain't no wife at all. You brought shame on yourself, girl, and I won't have it under my roof. Clara closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway, as vivid as the day it had happened 2 months prior. She could still see Thomas Whitmore's face, twisted with disappointment and rage, as Dr. Henderson had delivered his verdict in that sterile office that smelled of carbolic acid and broken dreams. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," the doctor had said, his voice clinical and detached. "The scarring from your previous illness has made conception impossible. You'll never bear children." Thomas had gone silent then, his jaw working as he stared at her as though she were a stranger. That night, he'd packed his belongings without a word, leaving only a hastily scrawled note on their kitchen table. "A man needs sons to carry on his name. You can't give me that. Don't try to find me." The humiliation that had followed had been worse than his abandonment. Thomas had spread word of her condition throughout their small Iowa community, painting her as damaged goods, a barren woman who had deceived him into marriage. Her own sister had turned her away, claiming that Clara's presence would bring bad luck to her own growing family. One by one, doors had closed, until Clara had found herself on a westbound train with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that distance might somehow heal what felt irreparably broken. But the frontier, she'd learned, could be just as cruel as the civilized world she'd left behind. A fresh gust of wind sent snow swirling around her makeshift shelter, and Clara pulled her knees closer to her chest. She'd eaten nothing but the stale biscuit she'd found behind the bakery yesterday morning, and weakness was beginning to make her thoughts fuzzy. Perhaps it would be easier to simply let the cold take her. At least then, the gnawing ache of emptiness inside her chest might finally stop. The sound of approaching horses cut through the wind's howl, and Clara looked up to see a wagon rolling down the town's main street. 2 small figures huddled in the back beneath a heavy buffalo hide, while a tall man in a dark coat handled the reins with practiced ease. Even through the driving snow, she could see the breadth of his shoulders and the determined set of his jaw as he guided his team toward the general store. Luke Hartwell pulled his wagon to a stop and secured the reins before helping his children down from the back. 8-year-old Emma, her dark hair braided neatly beneath her wool cap, clutched a small cloth doll against her chest, while 6-year-old Samuel stomped his boots to shake off the snow, his cheeks red from the cold. "Stay close," Luke instructed, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We'll get what we need and head straight home." As they approached the store's entrance, Samuel tugged on his father's coat sleeve. "Papa, there's a lady there." Luke followed his son's gaze to where Clara sat huddled in the shadows. For a moment, their eyes met across the swirling snow, and she saw something flicker in his weathered features. Not disgust or suspicion, but something that might have been recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be alone. "Wait here," he told his children, approaching Clara with cautious steps. Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 35, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a weariness that matched her own. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Are you all right?" Clara tried to speak, but her voice came out as little more than a whisper. "I'm fine, sir, just resting." Luke's gaze took in her thin frame, her inadequate clothing, the desperate way she clutched her small bundle. "When did you last eat?" The question, asked with such gentle directness, nearly undid her. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and looked away. "I don't need charity. Wasn't offering charity," Luke replied, was asking a question. Something in his tone made her meet his eyes again. There was no pity there, only a practical assessment of her situation. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. Luke nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You got family here in Mercy's Bend?" "No, sir." "Anywhere else?" Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice. Luke was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his words were measured, as though he were working through a problem in his mind. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here, lost my wife to consumption 18 months back, and I've been managing the house and the children on my own since then." He paused, glancing back at Emma and Samuel, who were watching the exchange with curious eyes. "Truth is, I'm not managing it well. The children need proper meals and someone to tend to their clothes and schooling." "I need someone to keep house." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. "Are you offering me work?" "I'm offering you a roof over your head and 3 meals a day in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and helping with the children," Luke said. "It's not charity. It's a fair trade. You'd have your own room, and I'd expect you to earn your keep." The wind gusted again, sending snow spiraling around them, and Clara felt the cold seep deeper into her bones. She thought of the long, empty road that stretched ahead of her if she refused, of the likelihood that she wouldn't survive another night in the open. But more than that, she thought of the way Luke had looked at her, not as a broken thing to be pitied, but as a person with something to offer. "I don't know anything about ranching," she said finally. "Don't need you to rope cattle," Luke replied. "Just need you to make a home." The word home hit her like a physical blow, carrying with it all the longing she'd tried so hard to suppress. Clara looked at the 2 children watching from beside the wagon, at their father, who stood waiting for her answer with patient dignity, and felt something stirring inside her that she'd thought was dead. "All right," she whispered. "I accept." Luke nodded once, as though settling a business transaction. "We'll get some supplies, then head back. Storm's getting worse." As they gathered the children and loaded the wagon with provisions, Clara caught Emma staring at her with solemn dark eyes that reminded her painfully of her own lost dreams. When Luke helped her up onto the wagon seat beside him, his hand was warm and steady against her elbow, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. The ride to the Hartwell Ranch was a silent affair. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through the snow-laden pines. Clara held tight to the wagon's side as they climbed into the foothills, leaving the scattered lights of Mercy's Bend far behind. The landscape here was even more desolate, if possible. Rolling hills and deep valleys carved by wind and time, dotted with the dark shapes of cattle huddled together for warmth. When the ranch house finally came into view, it looked like something from a fairy tale. A sturdy log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, warm yellow light glowing in its windows against the gathering darkness. Outbuildings clustered nearby like chicks around a hen, and Clara could hear the lowing of cattle in the distance. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Luke glanced at her as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "It's home," he said simply, and something in his voice suggested that he understood exactly how precious that simple word could be. As they unloaded the wagon and hurried toward the warmth of the house, Clara felt the first tentative flutter of hope she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. Perhaps this wasn't charity after all, but providence, a second chance at the life that had been torn away from her. She didn't dare hope for more than that. Not yet. The warmth of the Hartwell house enveloped Clara like an embrace as she stepped across the threshold, her frozen fingers tingling as feeling slowly returned to them. The main room was simple but well built, with thick log walls chinked against the winter wind and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A large wooden table sat in the center of the space, surrounded by mismatched chairs, while shelves lined with books and household items spoke of a family that had once thrived here. But it was the silence that struck Clara most, not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow emptiness of a home where laughter had died along with the woman who had once filled these rooms with life. "Emma, Samuel, get yourselves by the fire," Luke instructed as he set down the supplies. "Clara, let me show you where you'll be staying." He led her through a narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the house. It contained little more than a single bed with a faded quilt, a washstand, and a wooden chest. But to Clara, it looked like a palace. A tiny window faced east, and she could imagine morning sunlight streaming through the frost-etched glass. "It was meant to be a sewing room," Luke said, his voice carefully neutral. "My wife, Margaret, she had plans." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "There's extra blankets in the chest. We'll eat at 6, breakfast at dawn." Clara nodded, setting her meager bundle on the bed. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. I won't be any trouble." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or sadness. "Just Luke," he said quietly. "We don't stand much on ceremony here." That first night, Clara lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the wind rattling the windows and the distant sound of cattle moving in the night. Through the thin walls, she could hear Luke moving about the main room, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of logs being added to the fire. She wondered if he, too, found sleep elusive in this house full of memories. Dawn came gray and bitter, with fresh snow piling against the windows. Clara dressed quickly in the cold air and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Luke already up, standing at the stove with a look of grim concentration as he attempted to manage a skillet of eggs that were rapidly burning on one side while remaining raw on the other. "Let me," Clara said softly, moving to take the spatula from his hands. Their fingers brushed for just an instant, and she felt the calluses on his palms, the strength in his grip. "You see to the animals. I'll have breakfast ready when you're done." Luke hesitated, clearly unused to relinquishing control of his domain, but the smell of burning eggs convinced him. "The children like their eggs soft," he said, "and there's oatmeal in the pantry. They need to eat before their lessons." As he pulled on his heavy coat and headed out into the storm, Clara surveyed the kitchen with a practiced eye. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the wash basin. The stove needed cleaning, and the pantry, while well stocked, showed signs of a man's haphazard organization. She had work to do. By the time Luke returned, stamping snow from his boots and carrying the sharp scent of winter air on his clothes, Clara had transformed the chaotic kitchen into something resembling order. Fresh eggs sat perfectly cooked on warmed plates, alongside thick slices of bacon and bowls of creamy oatmeal sweetened with molasses. The children sat at the table, Emma picking at her food with the careful precision of a child who had learned not to expect much, while Samuel shoveled oatmeal into his mouth with the single-minded focus of a growing boy. "It's good," Samuel announced through a mouthful of food, and Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Emma said nothing, but Clara noticed that she cleaned her plate completely, something that, judging by Luke's surprised expression, didn't happen often. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Clara. She rose before dawn to start the fire and begin breakfast, worked through the morning cleaning and mending, and spent her afternoons teaching the children their letters and numbers while Luke tended to the cattle and repaired equipment. The children were polite but distant, watching her with the wariness of young animals that had learned not to trust too quickly. Emma was the more challenging of the two, a serious child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders. She rarely smiled and spoke only when spoken to, as though she'd learned that drawing attention to herself was dangerous. When Clara found her standing before her mother's portrait in the hallway, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, the little girl had fled to her room rather than accept comfort. Samuel was easier, hungry for attention and approval in the way of young boys. He chattered about the ranch animals during their lessons and proudly showed Clara the wooden horse his father had carved for him. But even he would sometimes grow quiet and withdrawn, staring out the window toward the family cemetery plot with an expression far too old for his years. "They lost their mother young," Clara told herself as she mended Emma's torn pinafore by lamplight. "They need time." But the truth was more complicated than that. In Emma's dark eyes, Clara saw her own reflection, a female who understood, on some deep level, that her worth was measured by her ability to nurture, to create life, to be needed, and in that recognition came a longing so sharp it took her breath away. She found herself lingering over small domestic tasks, braiding Emma's hair in the morning, teaching Samuel to write his name in careful letters, reading to them from the Bible after supper. These moments felt stolen, precious things that she had no right to claim, and yet she hoarded them like a miser hoards gold. Luke watched these interactions with an expression she couldn't read. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her as she helped Samuel with his arithmetic, or as she coaxed Emma to try another bite of her supper. His weathered face would soften almost imperceptibly, and something would flicker in his storm-gray eyes before he would look away, suddenly focused on his coffee or the fire or anything but her. He was unfailingly polite, thanking her for meals and asking after her comfort, but he maintained a careful distance. Clara noticed that he still wore his wedding ring, the gold band worn smooth by years of wear. She noticed, too, how he would sometimes pause before Margaret's portrait, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or conversation with his departed wife. The loneliness of the situation pressed on Clara like a physical weight. She was surrounded by the trappings of family life, children's laughter, the warmth of a shared hearth, the satisfaction of a well-run household, yet she remained fundamentally outside of it all. She was the hired help, the woman who cooked and cleaned and tended to other people's children because she would never have any of her own. But there were moments that gave her hope, like the evening when Emma fell asleep during Bible reading and Clara carried her to bed, feeling the child's warm weight against her shoulder and the trust implicit in that relaxed surrender to sleep. Or when Samuel proudly presented her with a drawing he'd made of the ranch, with 4 stick figures standing in front of the house: Luke, Emma, Samuel, and a woman in a blue dress that Clara realized was meant to be her. "That's our family," Samuel said matter-of-factly, and Clara's throat tightened with emotion she didn't dare name. It was during the second week of her stay that the real test came. Clara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of crying, not the normal tears of a child with a nightmare, but the desperate, painful sobs of someone in real distress. She found Emma in her small bedroom, burning with fever and calling for her mama between gasps of pain. "Luke!" Clara called out, already moving to feel the child's forehead and check her pulse. He appeared in the doorway within moments, his hair tousled from sleep, his face creased with worry. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, kneeling beside the bed. "I don't know. The fever's high." Clara was already moving with practiced efficiency, the skills learned during her own childhood when doctoring had been a necessity rather than a luxury. "We need to bring it down. Get me cool water and clean cloths." For the next several hours, they worked together in silent partnership. Clara sponged Emma's burning skin while Luke held his daughter's small hands, whispering reassurances and stories of better days. When the fever finally broke near dawn, Emma's eyes fluttered open to find Clara sitting beside her bed, exhaustion written in every line of her face. "Miss Clara?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Clara replied. smoothing damp hair back from the child's forehead. "You needed me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, not of pain this time, but of something that might have been relief or gratitude or the beginning of trust. "Mama used to sit with me when I was sick." Clara's throat constricted. "Would you like me to read to you until you fall back to sleep?" Emma nodded, and as Clara opened the book of fairy tales she'd found on the shelf, she felt Luke's gaze on her from the doorway. When she looked up, she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a recognition that she was more than just hired help, that she had become, in some small way, necessary to the functioning of this broken household. Later that morning, after Emma had fallen into peaceful sleep and Samuel had been fed and settled with his lessons, Clara found herself dozing in the chair beside the fireplace. She woke to find a quilt tucked around her shoulders and Luke adding wood to the fire with movements so quiet they hadn't disturbed her rest. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment the careful distance he'd maintained seemed to waver. "You sat up all night with my daughter," he said. "Least I can do is make sure you don't catch your death of cold." The snow continued to fall outside, piling higher against the windows and sealing them ever more completely into their small world, and in that enforced intimacy, Clara began to feel the first tentative stirrings of something she'd thought was dead forever, the possibility that she might, someday, belong somewhere again. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into February, when the world outside had turned into an endless expanse of white that seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread, when she heard the sharp crack of splitting wood followed by Luke's muffled curse from the woodshed. She found him sitting on a pile of split logs, his left shoulder pressed against his side at an unnatural angle, his face pale with pain. Blood seeped through his heavy wool shirt, where a jagged piece of wood had torn the fabric and the flesh beneath. "The axe handle snapped," he said through gritted teeth, trying to stand and failing. "Caught me off balance." Clara didn't hesitate. Years of caring for her ailing mother had taught her to act quickly in a crisis. "Don't try to move," she said, kneeling beside him in the sawdust and wood chips. "Let me see." Luke's jaw tightened. "It's nothing serious. Just need to bind it up." "Mr. Hartwell, Luke, please, let me help you." Something in her voice, perhaps the quiet authority she'd learned from necessity, made him stop protesting. Clara carefully pulled back the torn fabric of his shirt, her breath catching at the sight of the gash along his shoulder blade. It wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening, but it was bleeding freely and would need careful tending. "We need to get you inside," she said, standing and offering him her arm. "Can you walk?" Luke nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him to rise. As he leaned against her for support, Clara became acutely aware of his size and strength, even weakened as he was. His arm was solid muscle beneath her hands, and she could smell the clean scent of pine sap and honest sweat on his skin. They made slow progress to the house, Luke's breathing harsh in the cold air. Once inside, Clara helped him to a chair by the kitchen table and began gathering supplies. Clean rags, hot water, the bottle of whiskey Luke kept for medicinal purposes. "This might sting," she warned, pouring whiskey over the wound. Luke's sharp intake of breath was the only sign of his discomfort. As Clara worked, cleaning and examining the injury, she found herself studying the man before her with new eyes. His shoulders were broader than she'd realized, his back marked with the scars of a life lived outdoors, thin white lines that spoke of barbed wire and rough handling of cattle, a puckered mark near his ribs that could only have come from a bullet. These were the marks of a man who had fought for everything he had. "You'll need stitches," she said finally. "The bleeding's mostly stopped, but the edges won't heal clean without them." Luke nodded, his eyes closed. "There's a sewing kit in Margaret's. In the bedroom, thread should work." Clara fetched the kit, her heart clenching at the sight of the neat little basket filled with colorful threads and tiny, precise stitches half-finished on a child's dress. Margaret Hartwell had been a woman who cared about details, about making beautiful things in a harsh world. When she returned to the kitchen, Luke was trying unsuccessfully to remove his shirt one-handed. "Here," Clara said softly, setting the sewing basket aside. "Let me help." Her fingers were surprisingly steady as she helped him work his arms free of the sleeves. Though she was conscious of every place their skin touched, Luke's chest was lean and muscled, marked by the same honest scars that decorated his back, and Clara found herself having to concentrate harder than usual on the task at hand. "You've done this before," Luke observed as she threaded the needle. "My mother was sickly for years before she passed." Clara replied, not meeting his eyes, "I learned to tend wounds." She didn't mention that most of those wounds had been her mother's, self-inflicted in moments of despair over their circumstances. The stitching required Clara to lean close to Luke, her face mere inches from his shoulder as she worked. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, hear the measured rhythm of his breathing. Several times her fingers brushed against him as she maneuvered the needle, and each contact sent an unexpected tremor through her. "There," she said finally, tying off the last stitch. "That should hold." Luke turned to face her, and suddenly she realized how close they were sitting, how intimate the moment had become. His gray eyes searched her face, and she saw something in them she hadn't noticed before, not just gratitude, but awareness of her as a woman, not merely as the hired help. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. Clara's mouth went dry. "You should rest. I can manage the chores today." But Luke shook his head. "Can't ask you to do that. It's not your responsibility." "You're not asking," Clara replied, surprising herself with her firmness. "I'm telling you. You'll tear those stitches if you try to work today." Luke started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara Whitmore." The way he said her name, with a hint of something that might have been fondness, made her pulse quicken. "So I've been told." For the next several days, Clara found herself taking on tasks she'd never imagined doing, milking the cows, feeding the chickens, even helping to mend a section of fence that had been damaged by the wind. Luke chafed at his enforced idleness, but Clara had hidden his shirts to prevent him from doing anything that might reopen his wound. "This is ridiculous," he grumbled on the third day, watching from the kitchen window as Clara struggled with a particularly stubborn calf that didn't want to come in from the cold. "I should be out there. You should be healing," Clara replied firmly, not looking up from the sock she was darning. "Unless you want to explain to Emma and Samuel why their father can't use his left arm anymore." Luke fell silent at that, but Clara was aware of his eyes on her as she worked. The enforced closeness of the past few days had changed something between them, creating an undercurrent of tension that neither acknowledged but both felt. It was that evening, as Clara helped Luke change the bandage on his shoulder, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained finally began to crumble. Her fingers were gentle as she unwound the old cloth, checking for signs of infection or irritation. "It's healing well," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You have gentle hands," Luke said quietly. And when Clara looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. They were sitting on his bed, the first time Clara had been in his private space, with the lamp casting golden shadows on the log walls. The room was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, with Margaret's belongings still carefully arranged on the dresser. Clara was conscious of the intimacy of the moment, of Luke's bare chest and the trust implicit in his allowing her to tend to him. "I should finish wrapping this," she said, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, as she wound the fresh bandage around his shoulder. Luke's hand came up to cover hers. "Clara," he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Uncertainty, perhaps, or longing. She looked up to find his face close to hers, his eyes searching her features as though memorizing them. "I know this isn't. I know I have no right to ask anything of you beyond what we agreed. Luke." "You came here to work," he continued, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "To have a place to stay. Not for this." But even as he spoke, he was leaning closer, and Clara found herself drawn to him like metal to a magnet. When his lips finally met hers, it was with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. The kiss was brief, questioning, and when he pulled away, Clara could see her own confusion and desire reflected in his face. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Clara whispered, her hand still caught beneath his. "Please don't apologize." Luke's eyes searched hers, looking for permission, for understanding, for something she wasn't sure she could give. "You deserve better than this," he said finally. "Better than a broken-down widower with 2 children and a failing ranch." Clara felt tears threaten at the pain in his voice. "And you deserve better than a barren woman who can't give you more children." The words hung between them like a physical barrier. All the reasons why this was impossible, why caring for each other was a luxury neither could afford. Luke's hand tightened on hers, and for a moment Clara thought he might argue, might tell her that none of that mattered. Instead, he released her hand and turned away. "You should go," he said quietly. "The children will wonder where you are." Clara finished wrapping his shoulder in silence, her heart heavy with all the words they couldn't say. As she gathered the medical supplies, she was aware of Luke watching her, of the careful space he was maintaining between them now. At the doorway, she paused. "Luke?" He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Get some rest," she said simply, and closed the door behind her. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, her lips still tingling from Luke's kiss, and her heart aching with a longing she'd thought buried forever. Down the hall, she could hear him moving restlessly in his bed, and she wondered if he, too, was lying awake thinking about what had passed between them. The snow continued to fall outside, sealing them ever more completely into their small world, where the line between employer and employee, between kindness and something deeper, grew blurrier with each passing day. The trouble began with Mrs. Abigail Thornfield, a sharp-faced widow who owned the boarding house on the outskirts of Mercy's Bend and possessed the unfortunate combination of too much time and too little Christian charity. She arrived at the Hartwell Ranch on a bitter March morning, her buggy creaking through the mud left by the spring thaw, ostensibly to deliver a jar of preserves, but actually to satisfy her curiosity about the mysterious woman who had taken up residence with the widowed rancher. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the approaching wagon. Through the kitchen window, she watched as Mrs. Thornfield picked her way across the muddy yard, her dark dress pristine despite the treacherous footing, her eyes taking in every detail of the ranch with the calculating assessment of a woman who made other people's business her own. "Mrs. Thornfield," Luke said politely as he met her at the door, his hat in his hands. "What brings you out this way?" "Christian neighborliness, Mr. Hartwell," she replied, though her tone suggested anything but. "I brought some peach preserves for the children, and I confess, I was curious to meet the young woman I've heard so much about." Clara felt her stomach tighten as she entered the kitchen, smoothing her apron and attempting to compose her features into something resembling welcome. Mrs. Thornfield's pale eyes raked over her with undisguised assessment, taking in every detail from Clara's carefully mended dress to her work-roughened hands. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is Miss Clara Whitmore," Luke said, his voice carefully neutral. "Clara, Mrs. Thornfield runs the boarding house in town." "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Thornfield said, and Clara caught the emphasis on the title. "How interesting. I understood you were recently married?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "I'm a widow, ma'am." "Ah." Mrs. Thornfield's smile was thin and knowing. "How convenient. And how did you come to be in Mr. Hartwell's employ?" The questions continued for what felt like hours, each one more pointed than the last. Where had Clara come from? What had happened to her husband? Did she have family, references? Mrs. Thornfield's interrogation was conducted with a veneer of polite conversation, but her intent was unmistakable. She was looking for ammunition. "It's such a blessing," Mrs. Thornfield said finally, accepting a cup of coffee with the air of one conferring a great favor. "When a woman in difficult circumstances can find honest work. Though I must say, it's unusual for a man to take in a strange woman without proper references, especially one so young and, well, one must be careful of appearances. Mustn't one?" Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Whitmore came highly recommended," he said evenly, though Clara knew this was a lie. "She's been invaluable in caring for my children." "Oh, I'm sure she has," Mrs. Thornfield replied, and something in her tone made Clara's skin crawl. Children do so need a mother's touch, though of course that's not something every woman can provide, is it? Some are simply lacking in the necessary qualities. Clara felt the familiar stab of pain at the veiled reference to her barrenness, but she kept her expression composed. "The children are wonderful," she said quietly. "I'm fortunate to care for them." After Mrs. Thornfield finally departed, leaving behind her jar of preserves and the lingering scent of disapproval, Clara retreated to the kitchen with shaking hands. She had recognized the look in the woman's eyes, the same predatory gleam she'd seen in the faces of the women who had whispered about her back in Iowa. "Don't mind Abigail Thornfield," Luke said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "She's got nothing better to do than gossip." But Clara knew it was too late. She'd seen the calculation in Mrs. Thornfield's expression, the satisfaction of a woman who had found a new target for her malice. Within days, the poison would begin to spread. She was right. Emma was the first to feel it. She came home from school the following week with tears streaking her face and dirt on her dress from where she'd fallen during the recess. "What happened, sweetheart?" Clara asked, kneeling to examine a scrape on the child's knee. "Mary Beth Johnson said you're a bad lady," Emma whispered, her dark eyes swimming with confusion. "She said her mama told her that you're not a real lady at all, that you live in sin with Papa." Clara's hand stilled on the bandage she was applying. "What else did she say? That you're the kind of woman who can't have babies because God doesn't want you to. And that's why you're trying to steal other people's children." Emma's voice broke on the last words. "But that's not true, is it, Miss Clara? You wouldn't steal us?" Clara pulled the child into her arms, her heart breaking at the innocence in Emma's voice. "No, sweetheart, I would never steal you. I'm here to take care of you and Samuel because your papa asked me to, that's all." But even as she said the words, Clara felt the familiar weight of shame settling on her shoulders. How could she explain to a child that the world was full of people who found comfort in cruelty, who built themselves up by tearing others down? Samuel faced his own trial the next day. He came home with a black eye and split lip, his small fists still clenched in fury. "Billy Morrison said you're a fancy lady," he announced, his young voice full of righteous anger. "Said his PA knows all about fancy ladies from when he went to Denver. I hit him for lying about you." Luke's face went white, then red with rage. "He said what?" "Samuel," Clara said quickly, her heart racing. "You shouldn't fight over words. It's not worth it." "But he was lying," Samuel protested. "You're not a fancy lady. You make good biscuits and you read us stories and you sing when you think no one's listening. Fancy ladies don't do those things." "Do they?" Clara exchanged a look with Luke over the boy's head. She could see the fury building in his gray eyes, the dangerous stillness that preceded violence. "Luke," she said quietly, "don't." But that evening, after the children were in bed, Luke disappeared. Clara waited up, pacing the kitchen floor and imagining all the ways this could end badly. When he finally returned near midnight, his knuckles were scraped and there was satisfaction in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. "You didn't," she said, though she knew he had. "Billy Morrison's father won't be spreading any more lies about you," Luke said grimly. "Neither will anyone else who was at Murphy's saloon tonight." Clara sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "You've made it worse," she whispered. "Don't you see? Now they'll say you're defending me because Because we're what? Clara. Luke's voice was dangerously quiet. Because I care what happens to you? Because I won't stand by and let them treat you like some common... He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air between them. Clara looked up to find him watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, tender and fierce and utterly unguarded. You don't understand, she said, tears threatening. This is what happens. This is what always happens to women like me. We bring shame wherever we go. Luke crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her chair. Look at me, he said, taking her hands in his. You are not shameful. You are not damaged or lacking or any of the other cruel things they've called you. You are a good woman who deserves better than the hand life has dealt you. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't give you children. Luke, I can't give you what Margaret did. What any decent wife should. Luke's hands tightened on hers. I don't need you to be Margaret, he said fiercely. I need you to be you, Clara Whitmore, who sits up all night when my daughter is sick, who teaches my son to write his letters and doesn't lose patience when he struggles, who makes this house feel like a home again instead of just a place where we exist. The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying in their implications. Clara searched Luke's face, looking for some sign that he didn't mean it, that this was just pity or loneliness talking. But all she saw was truth, painful, complicated, impossible truth. They'll never accept it, she whispered. They'll never accept me. Luke leaned forward until his forehead touched hers. Then to hell with them, he said quietly. All of them. And then he was kissing her. Not gently this time, but with a desperation that spoke of months of suppressed longing. Clara felt herself responding despite every logical thought in her head, her hands tangling in his dark hair as she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his hands on either side of her face. I love you, he said simply. I don't care who knows it or what they think about it. I love you, Clara Whitmore, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Clara's heart soared and broke at the same time. She loved him too, desperately, hopelessly, with every damaged piece of her heart. But love, she'd learned, wasn't always enough to overcome the cruelty of the world. Luke, she began, but he silenced her with another kiss. Softer this time, but no less devastating. Don't, he murmured against her lips. Don't tell me all the reasons why this is impossible. I know them all. I've been listing them to myself for weeks. Just let me love you, even if it's only for tonight. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But inside the little ranch house, 2 wounded souls held each other close and pretended, for just a moment, that love could be enough to keep the darkness at bay. The blizzard struck 3 days later with a ferocity that seemed to mock their fragile human hopes. Clara woke to the sound of wind shrieking around the eaves like a thing possessed, rattling the windows so violently she feared they might shatter. Snow drove horizontally across the landscape, erasing all familiar landmarks and turning the world into a white void that stretched beyond sight. Luke was already up, moving through the house with grim efficiency as he checked the windows and doors for weak spots. It's a bad one, he said when he saw Clara in the kitchen. We could be snowed in for days. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation despite their youth, stayed close to the fire while Clara prepared what might be their last hot meal for some time. The wind was so loud they had to shout to be heard, and with each gust, the little house seemed to shudder on its foundations. By afternoon, the temperature inside had dropped noticeably despite the roaring fire. Luke brought in every piece of wood he could carry from the rapidly disappearing woodshed. But they all knew it wouldn't be enough if the storm lasted long. We'll need to conserve heat, Luke said as evening fell and the blizzard showed no signs of abating. The main room is the warmest. We should all sleep here tonight. Clara nodded, understanding the practical necessity even as her pulse quickened at the implications. They arranged bedding on the floor near the fireplace, the children closest to the warmth, Clara and Luke flanking them like protective bookends. Emma and Samuel, exhausted by the day's tension, fell asleep quickly despite the howling wind. But Clara lay awake, achingly aware of Luke's presence just a few feet away. She could hear his breathing, could sense when he turned restlessly in his blankets. The storm had trapped them in an intimacy more complete than anything they'd shared before, stripping away the careful boundaries they'd maintained. "Clara?" His voice was barely audible above the wind. "Are you awake?" "Yes," she whispered back. "Come here. You're shivering." Clara hesitated, knowing that crossing that small space would change everything between them. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and Luke's warmth called to her like a beacon in the darkness. She moved carefully, trying not to wake the children, until she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from Luke's body. Without a word, he lifted his blanket, creating a shelter that encompassed them both. Clara settled against him, her back pressed to his chest, his arm coming around her waist to hold her close. For a while they lay in silence, listening to the storm's fury and the steady breathing of the sleeping children. But gradually, Clara became aware of other things: the solid strength of Luke's body behind her, the gentle brush of his breath against her hair, the way his thumb traced small circles on her arm through the fabric of her nightgown. "Tell me about your husband," Luke said quietly. "Your real husband." Clara tensed. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. What he did to you. It's written all over your face every time someone mentions children or marriage or family. I need to know what I'm fighting against." Clara was quiet for so long that Luke thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Thomas was charming when we first met, handsome, well-spoken. He courted me properly, brought flowers, spoke of building a future together. I thought I was the luckiest woman in Iowa." She paused, gathering strength. "The trouble started almost immediately after we married. He wanted sons right away, heirs to carry on the family name. When months passed without result, he became impatient, then angry." Luke's arm tightened around her. "He took me to doctor after doctor, subjecting me to examinations that were humiliating. Each time they found nothing wrong. Thomas became more convinced that I was somehow preventing conception deliberately. He made me drink terrible concoctions, herbs and medicines that made me violently ill. He watched my monthly cycles like a hawk, timing intimate moments according to what some traveling doctor had told him." Clara's voice broke slightly. "When Dr. Henderson finally diagnosed the scarring from my childhood fever, Thomas flew into a rage. He said I'd deceived him, that I'd trapped him into marriage under false pretenses. He called me unnatural, cursed, said that any woman who couldn't fulfill her most basic purpose wasn't really a woman at all." Luke made a low sound of anger deep in his throat. "The night before he left, Clara's voice dropped to barely audible. "He forced himself on me one last time, saying that if I was going to be barren anyway, he might as well use me as God intended such women to be used. Like I was something to be consumed and discarded." Luke's entire body had gone rigid behind her. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with rage and sorrow. "After he left, the whispers started. Thomas had made sure everyone knew why our marriage had failed. The decent women crossed the street to avoid me. The men—" She shuddered. "The men looked at me the way they might look at a horse with a broken leg, something that might still have some use even if it couldn't do what it was bred for." In the firelight, tears slipped silently down Clara's cheeks. Luke turned her gently in his arms so she was facing him, his weathered hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "You are not broken. You are not cursed or unnatural or any of the cruel things that man called you. You are a woman of strength and grace and compassion. And the fact that you can't bear children doesn't diminish your worth by even the smallest measure." Clara searched his face in the flickering light. "How can you say that? You have children. You know the joy they bring. How can you not want more?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, his thumb brushing away her tears. When he spoke, His voice was raw with emotion. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the woman who sits up all night when Emma has fever dreams, singing lullabies in a voice like an angel. I see the patience you show Samuel when he struggles with his letters, never making him feel stupid or slow. I see how you've brought laughter back to this house, how you've made us feel like a family again when I thought that was impossible." He paused, pressing his forehead against hers. "Margaret gave me 2 beautiful children, and I will always be grateful for that gift. But you've given them something else entirely. You've given them hope. You've shown them that they can be loved again, that our family isn't over just because their mother died." Clara felt fresh tears spilling over. "But I can never give you sons to carry on your name, daughters to—" "I don't need my blood to carry on my name." Luke interrupted. "I need my love to carry on my legacy. And you've helped me learn how to love again, Clara, how to see past my own grief and fear and open my heart to possibilities I thought were gone forever." The wind howled around them, but in their small cocoon of warmth and honesty, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of being truly known and accepted for exactly who she was. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of believing you, of letting myself hope that this could be real, that we could have a life together. I'm afraid that tomorrow you'll wake up and remember all the reasons why this is impossible." Luke's response was to kiss her, soft and sure and full of promise. When they parted, his eyes held steady on hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. "And neither are you. Not if I have anything to say about it." Clara felt the last of her resistance crumble. With a soft cry, she buried her face against Luke's chest, finally allowing herself to accept the love he was offering. His arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her as though she were something precious. They held each other as the storm raged outside, 2 people who had been broken by life finding wholeness in each other's arms. When Clara finally lifted her face to his again, Luke kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of forever, of promises made and kept, of love that could weather any storm. "I love you too," Clara whispered against his lips, the words she'd been too afraid to speak finally finding their voice. "I love you, Luke Hartwell, and I'm tired of being afraid." They made love then, quietly and carefully so as not to wake the children, their joining as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. It was nothing like the mechanical coupling Clara had endured with Thomas. This was a celebration, a claiming, a promise exchanged in whispers and gentle touches, and the kind of trust that comes only when 2 souls recognize each other as home. Afterward, they lay entwined beneath the shared blanket, Clara's head on Luke's chest, his fingers combing through her hair. The storm still raged outside, but it no longer seemed threatening. Instead, it felt like nature's blessing on their union, sealing them together in their small sanctuary of love. "When this storm passes," Luke said quietly, "we'll face whatever comes together, the gossips, the judgment, all of it, but we'll face it as one." Clara nodded, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. For the first time in her adult life, she felt complete, not because a man had chosen her, but because she had chosen herself worthy of love. Outside, the wind began to quiet, and the first pale light of dawn crept across the snow-covered landscape. The storm was passing, and with it, the last of Clara's doubts about her place in this family, in this life, in Luke's heart. They had found each other in the darkness, and now, together, they would step into the light. The weeks that followed the blizzard passed in a dreamlike haze of quiet contentment. Clara and Luke had crossed an invisible threshold that night, and while they maintained discretion for the children's sake, their relationship had fundamentally changed. They moved around each other with the easy intimacy of longtime partners, their hands finding excuses to touch as they passed in the kitchen, their eyes meeting across the dinner table with shared understanding. Clara found herself humming as she went about her daily tasks, a lightness in her step that had been absent for years. When Luke came in from the morning chores, snow dusting his shoulders and his cheeks reddened by the cold. She would pour him coffee and feel a warm satisfaction at the simple act of caring for him. When he smiled at her over his cup, something inside her chest would flutter like a bird taking wing. The children, with the acute sensitivity of the young, sensed the change in the household's atmosphere. Emma began seeking Clara's approval more openly, proudly showing off her improving penmanship and asking for help with the more intricate stitches in her embroidery. Samuel grew bolder in his affections, climbing into Clara's lap during evening story time and declaring that she told tales better than anyone, even better than his mama used to. "Do you think Papa will marry Miss Clara?" Clara overheard Emma whisper to her brother one evening as they prepared for bed. "I hope so," Samuel replied with the frank honesty of childhood. "She makes good apple pie, and she doesn't get angry when I track mud on the floor." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. These children, who had lost so much, were beginning to trust again, to hope for permanence. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. Luke must have overheard the conversation too, because later that night, as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "I've been working on something," he said, his voice unusually uncertain. Clara watched as he unwrapped what appeared to be a ring, simple silver, clearly handmade, with a small design etched around the band. "I melted down my wedding ring," Luke said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Margaret's too. Made something new from what came before." He looked up then, his gray eyes vulnerable in the firelight. "It's not much, but it's beautiful," Clara breathed, reaching out to touch the ring with trembling fingers. The silver was warm from his pocket, and she could see where his careful work had transformed the symbols of his past into something entirely new. "Luke, I know we can't make it official yet," he said quickly. "Not with the way people are talking, but I wanted you to have something that showed you belong here. With us, with me." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The ring represented everything she had thought lost to her forever: love, commitment, a place where she was wanted not despite her flaws but because of who she was entirely. "I love you," she whispered, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her hand specifically. "And I love you," Luke replied, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "More than I thought possible." They spent their evenings that spring planning for the future. Luke spoke of expanding the ranch, perhaps adding more cattle or trying his hand at horses. Clara suggested improvements to the house, a larger kitchen, perhaps, and definitely better insulation for the long winters. They talked about Emma's education, about Samuel's fascination with the mechanical workings of things, about the small daily joys of building a life together. On warm afternoons, they would take the children on walks across the prairie, Emma collecting wildflowers while Samuel chased after grasshoppers and beetles. Clara taught them to identify different plants, sharing the knowledge her mother had passed down about which herbs could soothe a fever or settle an upset stomach. Luke showed Samuel how to read the weather in the behavior of animals, how to spot the signs of approaching storms in the color of the sky. These moments felt precious and fragile, like something that might disappear if examined too closely. Clara often found herself memorizing small details, the way Samuel's face scrunched in concentration when he practiced his letters, the rare smile that transformed Emma's serious features, the sound of Luke's laughter when the children said something particularly amusing. It was during one of these peaceful interludes that their temporary happiness was shattered. Clara was in the garden, coaxing the first green shoots from the earth with Emma's help, when she heard horses approaching. Looking up, she felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. She knew that silhouette, that particular set of the shoulders, even after all these months. Thomas Whitmore sat astride a bay gelding, looking travel-worn and considerably less prosperous than when she had last seen him. His clothes were dusty and patched, his face gaunt with what appeared to be recent hardship. But his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered, and when his gaze fell on her, his mouth curved in a smile that held no warmth. "Hello, Clara," he said, dismounting with the fluid grace she had once found attractive. "You're looking well. Rural life seems to agree with you." Emma, sensing the tension in Clara's posture, moved closer to her side. "Who is that man, Miss Clara?" Before Clara could answer, Luke appeared from the barn, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. Samuel, who had been helping his father mend harness, stayed close to Luke's side, his young face wary. "Thomas," Clara managed, her voice barely steady. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for my wife," Thomas replied easily, as though they were discussing the weather. Imagine my surprise when I heard she'd taken up with a rancher in Wyoming, playing house with another man's children, from what I understand. Luke stepped forward, his body language protective and dangerous. "The lady's name is Miss Whitmore, and you're not welcome here." Thomas's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "Miss Whitmore? Is that what she's calling herself now?" He turned back to Clara, his expression hardening. "We're still legally married. Clara, that little detail seems to have slipped your mind." Clara's world tilted on its axis. In all her dreams of a future with Luke, she had somehow forgotten the legal bonds that still tied her to her former life. "You left me," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You abandoned me and told everyone why. You made it clear you never wanted to see me again." "I was angry," Thomas said with a dismissive wave. "Men say things they don't mean when they're disappointed. But I've had time to think, and I've decided to forgive you. We can start over. Try again in a new place where people don't know about your condition." "Forgive me?" Clara's voice rose in disbelief. "For what? For having scarlet fever as a child? For not being able to control the consequences of an illness I couldn't prevent?" Thomas's mask of reasonableness slipped. "For deceiving me," he snapped. "For letting me marry you under false pretenses. But I'm willing to overlook that now. I've found opportunities out in California, gold prospects that could make us rich. You could be useful there. In the camps, there's always work for women willing to cook and provide other services." The implications of his words hit Clara like a physical blow. Luke made a sound low in his throat that was barely human, his hands clenching into fists. "You will not speak to her that way," Luke said, his voice deadly quiet. "Not on my land." Thomas looked between them with growing understanding. "Ah, I see. You've been playing the devoted housekeeper while warming his bed on the side. Very clever. Clara, though I have to say, I'm disappointed. I didn't think you had it in you to be so enterprising." Luke moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move. His fist connected with Thomas's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, sending the smaller man sprawling in the dirt. Thomas rolled and came up spitting blood, his hand moving to his belt where Clara could see the handle of a knife. "Papa!" Emma cried out in alarm. "Take the children inside," Luke ordered Clara without taking his eyes off Thomas. "Now?" Clara wanted to protest, wanted to stand and fight beside the man she loved. But the sight of Emma and Samuel's frightened faces decided her. She herded them toward the house, her heart pounding with terror at what might happen in her absence. "You can hit me all you like," she heard Thomas call after them. "But it doesn't change the facts. She's my wife, legally and in the eyes of God. What you've been doing with her is adultery, plain and simple." Clara stumbled, the word hitting her like another physical blow. Emma clutched at her skirts, sensing the adult's distress even if she didn't understand its source. Once inside, Clara settled the children by the fire and tried to peer through the window at the confrontation in the yard. She could see Luke and Thomas facing each other, their body language speaking of violence barely held in check. Her hands shook as she realized the truth of Thomas's words. She was still married to him, which meant everything she had built with Luke was founded on a lie. When Luke finally entered the house, his knuckles were scraped and there was a look in his eyes that Clara had never seen before. Defeat mixed with rage and something that might have been despair. "He's gone," Luke said quietly. "For now." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The children looked between them with frightened eyes, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their small world. That night, after Emma and Samuel were finally asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table staring at the ring on her finger, the ring that now felt like a mockery of everything she had hoped for. "I have to go," she said quietly when Luke joined her. "No." Luke's voice was flat, final. "We'll find another way." "What way?" Clara looked up at him with eyes full of tears. "He's right. Luke, we're not married. What we have, it's not legal. It's not right. Don't let him poison what we have," Luke said fiercely. "He abandoned you. He forfeited any claim to you when he walked away." "But not legally," Clara whispered. "And not in the eyes of God or society. I won't make you an adulterer. Luke, I won't let my shame touch you and the children." Luke knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You are not shameful. What we have is not shameful." But Clara was already pulling away, already retreating behind the walls she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of pain. Thomas's arrival had reminded her of a fundamental truth she had allowed herself to forget. Women like her didn't get happy endings. They got by, they survived, but they didn't get to keep the things they loved most. "I'll leave in the morning," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's better this way." Luke's hands tightened on hers, but Clara could see in his eyes that he understood the impossibility of their situation as clearly as she did. Thomas held all the legal cards, and fighting him would only bring scandal and ruin to Luke and the children she had come to love as her own. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the promise of another storm. But this time, Clara knew there would be no shelter from the cold. Clara left before dawn, while the house still slumbered in the gray half-light that preceded sunrise. She moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, gathering her few belongings with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain steady. The silver ring Luke had made for her remained on the kitchen table, catching the first pale rays of morning light, a symbol of dreams that could never be. She paused at the children's bedroom door, listening to their peaceful breathing, memorizing the sound. Emma had kicked off her covers in the night, and Clara's hands itched to tuck them back around the child's small form. Samuel clutched his wooden horse to his chest, his face relaxed in sleep, free from the confusion and fear that had marked it the day before. These children had become her heart, and leaving them felt like tearing away pieces of her soul. But she could not, would not, be the cause of their father's ruin or their own social exile. They deserved better than the scandal her presence would bring. Clara slipped a letter under Luke's bedroom door. The words she couldn't say aloud spelled out in careful script. "Please don't come after me. Please don't let the children think badly of me. Please remember that I loved you all more than life itself." Then she shouldered her small bundle and walked out into the morning mist, leaving behind the only real home she had ever known. The walk to Mercy's Bend felt endless, each step taking her further from everything that mattered. The spring morning was beautiful. Wild flowers dotted the meadows, and birds called from the scattered cottonwoods. But Clara saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of moving away from love before it could destroy the people she cherished most. She found herself, hours later, standing at the edge of the small cemetery that overlooked the town. Weathered headstones marked the resting places of those who had come west, seeking new lives, and found only death in the unforgiving landscape. In the center of the plot, beneath a spreading oak tree, stood a more recent grave marked with a simple cross: Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved wife and mother. Clara knelt beside the grave, her traveling dress pooling around her in the grass that was just beginning to turn green with spring's promise. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the woman who had been everything Clara could never be. "I tried to take care of them. I tried to love them the way they deserved. But I've failed them, just like I fail everyone who tries to care about me." The tears came then. All the grief and loss and self-hatred she had been holding back since Thomas's arrival. She wept for the children she would never see grow up, for Luke's love that she had to cast aside, for her own broken dreams of belonging somewhere. She wept until she had no tears left, until she felt hollowed out and empty as a winter tree. "You're a hard woman to find." Clara's head snapped up to find Luke standing at the edge of the cemetery, his dark hair disheveled and his clothes bearing signs of a hasty departure. His gray eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been tears. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said, scrambling to her feet and wiping at her face. "People will see." "I don't care who sees," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care what they think or say or do. The only thing I care about is you." Clara shook her head, backing away from him. "You don't understand. Thomas was right. We're not married. What we did, what we felt, it was wrong. I won't drag you down with me." Luke advanced on her with the steady determination of a man who had made up his mind. "What we felt was love. Clara, pure and simple and honest. There was nothing wrong with it." "The law says differently," Clara replied, her voice breaking. "Society says differently. Your children will be marked by scandal if you continue to associate with me. Is that what you want for Emma and Samuel? To be known as the offspring of a man who consorts with another man's wife?" Luke stopped just out of arm's reach, his hands clenched at his sides. "My children need their mother," he said quietly. "Not the woman who bore them, but the woman who loves them. That's you, Clara. That's always been you." The words hit Clara like physical blows. "I can't be their mother," she whispered. "I can't be anyone's mother. Don't you see? I'm broken, damaged, cursed." "Stop," Luke's voice cracked like a whip. "Stop saying those things about yourself. Stop letting that bastard's poison fill your mind." Clara laughed bitterly. "It's not poison if it's true. Look at the evidence. Luke, every man who has ever tried to love me has been destroyed by it. My father died working himself to death trying to provide for a daughter who would never give him grandchildren. Thomas was driven to cruelty and abandonment. And now Now me what?" Luke demanded, closing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. "I'm destroyed. I'm ruined. Clara, before you came to my ranch, I was already dead inside. I was just going through the motions of living, caring for my children but unable to feel anything but grief and emptiness. You brought me back to life." He reached out to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away fresh tears. "You want to know what you've given me? Hope, joy, the ability to wake up in the morning and look forward to the day instead of just enduring it. You've given me back my heart. Clara Whitmore. How is that destruction?" Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite herself. "But Thomas is a coward and a fool who threw away the most precious thing he could have had," Luke said fiercely. "But his stupidity doesn't get to dictate our future." Clara opened her eyes to find Luke staring at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "What are you saying?" Luke released her face and stepped back, then slowly dropped to one knee beside Margaret's grave. From his pocket, he withdrew the silver ring Clara had left behind, holding it up like an offering. "I'm saying, marry me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Clara could see swimming in his eyes. "Not legally. Not yet. I know we can't do that while you're still bound to him. But marry me in the eyes of God and in the sight of the woman who loved me before you did." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Luke, Margaret would have wanted this," he continued, glancing down at the grave marker. "She would have wanted our children to have a mother's love, would have wanted me to find happiness again. She was generous that way, always thinking of others before herself." He looked back up at Clara, and she saw her own desperate love reflected in his features. "Marry me, Clara. Promise to be my wife in all the ways that matter, even if we can't make it official yet. Promise to stay and fight for this family we've built together." Clara stared down at him, this good man kneeling in the dirt beside his first wife's grave, offering her everything she had ever wanted and everything she was terrified to take. "People will never accept it," she whispered. "They'll call us sinners, adulterers." "Then let them," Luke said simply. "Their opinions don't keep us warm at night or put food on our table or love our children. We do that, together. The morning sun broke through the clouds at that moment, casting golden light across the cemetery and warming Clara's face. She thought of Emma and Samuel, probably awake by now and wondering where she had gone. She thought of the empty house that would no longer ring with laughter, of Luke trying to manage alone again, of all the small daily joys they would lose if she walked away. And she thought of the woman buried beneath the oak tree, who had loved this man enough to trust him with her children's futures. What would Margaret Hartwell want for the people she had left behind? Loneliness? Sacrifice for the sake of appearances? Or love, messy and imperfect and brave enough to face down a disapproving world? Yes, Clara whispered, the word barely audible. Then, stronger, yes, Luke Hartwell. I'll marry you in every way that matters. Luke's face transformed with joy and relief. He slipped the ring back onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed despite her tears. When he set her down, they were both breathless, giddy with the audacity of what they were choosing. We'll make it work, Luke promised. His forehead pressed to hers. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Clara nodded, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this happiness. Together, she agreed. As they walked back toward the ranch, hand in hand, Clara felt the weight of years of shame and self-doubt beginning to lift from her shoulders. She was still legally bound to Thomas, still vulnerable to society's judgment, still unable to give Luke biological children of his own. But she was no longer alone, no longer convinced that love was something that happened to other people. Behind them, the morning sun climbed higher, casting their intertwined shadows long across the prairie grass, and on her grave beneath the oak tree, Margaret Hartwell's marker caught the light, as if offering her blessing on the imperfect, precious family that would continue in her name. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer empty. Whatever challenges awaited, Clara and Luke would meet them as they had learned to meet everything else, together, with courage born of love and the quiet strength that came from finally, truly, coming home. 1 year later, the Hartwell Ranch had transformed into something Clara had never dared to imagine. A place where laughter echoed from every corner and love had taken root so deeply that even the harshest Wyoming winter couldn't shake it loose. The legal complications with Thomas had resolved themselves in the most unexpected way. Word had reached them through a traveling merchant that Clara's former husband had met his end in a mining accident outside Sacramento, crushed beneath a cave-in while pursuing the gold that had always mattered more to him than people. Clara had felt no grief at the news, only a profound sense of release, like a bird whose cage door had finally swung open. Luke had wasted no time. Within a month of receiving confirmation of Thomas's death, he had arranged for them to travel to Cheyenne, where a judge married them in a simple ceremony with Emma and Samuel as witnesses. Clara had worn her one good dress, blue as a summer sky, and Luke had presented her with a proper gold wedding band to wear alongside the silver ring he had crafted with his own hands. Now it's official, he had whispered against her ear as they signed the marriage certificate, and Clara had felt the last of her fears finally dissolve. The changes that followed were gradual, but profound. Clara had approached the schoolmaster in Mercy's Bend with a proposal. She would provide education for the orphaned children who had nowhere else to go, teaching them not just letters and numbers, but practical skills that would help them survive in the frontier world. To her surprise, the townspeople had embraced the idea, even Mrs. Thornfield, chastened perhaps by the realization that her gossip had been proven wrong, had donated supplies and offered grudging approval. The small cabin behind the main house that Luke had built for Clara's classroom rang with children's voices 3 days a week. She taught reading and writing, basic arithmetic, and the domestic skills that would serve them well in their future lives. But more than that, she gave them what she had always craved herself, the knowledge that they were worthy of love and care, regardless of their circumstances. It was during one of these lessons that 8-year-old Mary, a Shoshone child whose parents had died in the epidemic the previous winter, had shyly approached Clara with a drawing. "This is you," Mary had said, pointing to a figure in a blue dress standing in front of a house. "And this is me. Can I stay with you? I don't want to go to the mission school." Clara's heart had clenched at the longing in the child's dark eyes. That evening, she and Luke had talked long into the night about the possibility of formal adoption. By autumn, Mary Hartwell had joined their family officially, her legal papers bearing Clara's name as her mother. The transformation in all the children was remarkable. Emma, now 10, had blossomed into a confident young lady who helped Clara with the younger students and showed remarkable aptitude for healing arts. She spoke often of wanting to become a doctor someday, a dream that Clara encouraged despite its unconventional nature. Samuel, 8 years old and growing like a weed, had developed an intense interest in mechanical things. He spent hours with Luke learning to repair equipment and had shown such natural talent that Luke had begun teaching him more advanced skills. The boy's laughter came easily now, and he had taken to calling Clara Mama as naturally as breathing. Mary, shy at first, had gradually revealed a gift for languages and an encyclopedic knowledge of local plants and their uses. She served as translator when other tribal children came to the school, and her presence had helped bridge the gap between the ranch family and the native community. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Clara. Evenings when the family gathered around the fireplace, Emma reading aloud from one of her books while Samuel whittled and Mary practiced her letters. Luke would sit in his chair, mending harness or sharpening tools, occasionally looking up to catch Clara's eye across the room with a smile that still made her heart skip. The townspeople of Mercy's Bend had gradually come to accept and even admire the unconventional family. Clara's work with the orphaned children had earned her respect, and Luke's reputation as an honest rancher had never wavered. Mrs. Thornfield still pursed her lips in disapproval occasionally, but even she couldn't argue with the results of Clara's teaching or the obvious happiness of the Hartwell children. "You've built something remarkable here, Doctor," Matthews had told Clara during his monthly visit to check on the children's health. "These youngsters are thriving in ways I've rarely seen. You have a gift for nurturing." Clara had smiled at the irony. She, who had been told she was unfit for motherhood, had become mother to not just 3 children, but to every orphaned soul who found their way to her classroom. On this particular evening in late September, as the aspen leaves turned gold on the mountainsides and the first hint of winter touched the air, Clara stood on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The sounds of her family drifted from inside, Emma helping Mary with her arithmetic, while Samuel regaled Luke with tales of his adventures with the barn cats. Strong arms encircled her from behind, and Clara leaned back against Luke's solid chest with a contented sigh. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Hartwell," he murmured against her hair. Clara smiled at the title she would never tire of hearing. "I was thinking about how strange life is," she said. "A year ago, I thought my story was over. I thought I was destined to live on the margins, taking whatever scraps of affection people might spare for someone like me." Luke's arms tightened around her. "And now I understand that God doesn't always give us what we think we want," Clara said softly. "Sometimes He gives us what we actually need instead. I spent so many years mourning the children I couldn't have that I almost missed the children He intended for me all along." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside came the sound of Mary's giggling as Samuel told another of his increasingly embellished stories. "Do you ever regret it?" Luke asked quietly. "Taking on 3 children who needed so much, having to fight for acceptance in a community that wasn't always welcoming?" Clara turned in his arms so she could see his face in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This family, this life we've built, it's worth every struggle, every whispered comment, every moment of doubt." Luke's eyes softened. "I love you, Clara Hartwell, more today than yesterday, and I know I'll love you more tomorrow than today." "And I love you," Clara replied, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth fighting for. Thank you for being brave enough to fight alongside me." As they kissed under the vast Wyoming sky, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them here. She had come to this place broken and desperate, convinced that her life held no value because she couldn't fulfill society's expectations of womanhood. Instead, she had discovered that there were many ways to be a mother, many paths to creating a family, many definitions of love worth having. The sound of children's laughter drew them back inside, where Emma was attempting to teach Mary a complicated knitting stitch, while Samuel performed dramatic reenactments of his day's adventures for their entertainment. This was Clara's legacy, not the biological children she had mourned, but these precious souls who had needed exactly what she had to offer. As the family settled in for the evening, Clara looked around at each beloved face and felt her heart swell with gratitude. Love, she had learned, wasn't always about blood or biology or meeting conventional expectations. Sometimes love was about choice, the daily decision to show up, to care, to fight for the people who mattered most. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love was about finding your way home to a place you never knew existed, with people who saw your worth when you couldn't see it yourself. The fire crackled in the hearth, the children's voices mingled in harmony, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for Clara and Luke's story of love, redemption, and finding family in unexpected places. We hope this tale of the American frontier touched your heart and reminded you that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest struggles. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you at home by your own fireplace, perhaps on a long commute, or maybe under the stars somewhere? Please leave a comment and let us know where this Wild West love story found you. We cherish connecting with fellow lovers of frontier tales and hearing how these stories resonate with your own journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more authentic stories of love, loss, and new beginnings on the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Clara and Luke's journey, and let us know what other tales from the Old West you'd like to hear around our campfire. Until next time, may your own story be filled with the kind of love worth fighting for.